My name is Amelia. I'm 46 years old, and for the most part, my life has been quiet, predictable even. I've built a world of routines, one that feels safe and easy to navigate. Mornings start with coffee by the window. Afternoons are spent editing manuscripts in my cozy home office, and evenings end with a book or a glass of wine. It's a life I've grown comfortable with, though, if I'm honest. I sometimes wonder if comfort has come at the cost of something more. It was an ordinary Tuesday when everything changed. I'd gone to the cafe down the street, my usual spot for a mid-morning escape. The smell of fresh pastries and the soft hum of conversations created a comforting backdrop as I settled into my corner table with a cappuccino and a novel I'd been meaning to finish. That's when I noticed him. He walked in with a confidence that was impossible to ignore, tall, lean, and effortlessly charismatic. His dark hair was slightly messy, as if he'd just rolled out of bed, and his eyes carried an energy that drew me in instantly. He couldn't have been older than 27 or 28, yet there was something about him that seemed wise beyond his years. I watched as he ordered at the counter, his voice low and smooth. When he turned, his gaze swept over the room, pausing for the briefest moment when it landed on me. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just his looks that caught me off guard. It was the way he carried himself, like someone who belonged wherever he went. I should have looked away, but I couldn't. Instead, I sat there, pretending to read while stealing glances at him from behind my book. He chose a seat near the window, a notebook and pen in hand. He scribbled something down, occasionally pausing to sip his coffee, lost in thought. There was an energy about him that was magnetic, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt drawn to it. It had been years since anyone had made me feel this way. Years since I'd allowed myself to feel anything at all. When he left, I found myself lingering in my seat, staring at the door as if willing him to come back. The moment stayed with me long after he was gone, an unfamiliar ache settling in my chest. The next day, I returned to the cafe at the same time, hoping to see him again. And there he was, seated at the same table by the window, his notebook open. This time, I watched more closely, noticing the way his hand moved fluidly across the page, how his lips would curl into a faint smile as if he were amusing himself with some private thought. I didn't approach him. Instead, I left when he did, keeping a careful distance as I followed him out into the city streets. It felt reckless and absurd, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to know more about him, who he was, what he did, and why he had such a hold on me. For 3 days, I observed him from afar. I learned his patterns. The cafe in the morning, the park in the afternoon, the bookstore where he lingered among the shelves before heading home to an apartment not far from my own. Each time I saw him, my curiosity grew. And so did something else, something deeper, more unsettling. A longing I hadn't felt in years. By the 3rd day, I began to notice subtle things. The way his gaze would linger on me just a moment longer than necessary, the faint smile that tugged at his lips when our eyes met, the way he seemed to adjust his pace as if waiting for me to catch up. It wasn't just me. He had noticed me too, to be why the 4th morning. My heart was restless, my thoughts consumed by this man whose name I didn't even know. I woke up early, staring at my reflection in the mirror longer than usual. I wasn't 20 anymore. I wasn't even 30, but for the first time in years, I cared about how I looked. My hand smoothed my hair into place, and I chose a soft, flowing dress that made me feel just a little more alive. I returned to the cafe with a strange blend of excitement and nerves swirling inside me. He was already there, seated at his usual spot by the window, his notebook open and a small smile playing on his lips. But this time, when his eyes found mine, he didn't look away. There it was, undeniable, electric. That fleeting moment of connection. I sat down at my corner table, trying to appear composed, but my heart betrayed me, pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I pretended to read again, though I wasn't absorbing a single word. Every now and then, I'd steal a glance, only to catch him doing the same. By now, I had memorized his movements, the way he held his coffee cup with both hands, how he tapped his pen against the edge of his notebook when he was deep in thought. But today he seemed distracted, his gaze darting toward me more often than usual. When he stood to leave, I thought the moment would pass like the others, him walking out the door, and me, quietly watching from a distance. But instead he hesitated. He turned. For a breathless second, I thought he might say something, but then his lips curved into the faintest of smiles before he walked out into the street. That smile stayed with me all day, lingering in the corners of my mind like a melody I couldn't forget. It was as if he were saying, "I see you. I know you see me too." The next day, I decided to change my routine. Instead of waiting for him at the cafe, I went to the park where he usually spent his afternoons. I sat on a bench with a book in hand, though my eyes barely scanned the pages. I waited, feeling equal parts nervous and foolish. When he appeared, it was as if the entire park came alive. The golden light of the setting sun seemed to follow him, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw, the confident ease in his stride. He found a spot under a tree not far from where I sat, his notebook in hand as always. But this time he didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back against the tree trunk, his gaze sweeping across the park before settling on me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He was looking at me, and there was no mistaking the intention behind it. This wasn't a casual glance or a momentary flicker of interest. It was something more, something deliberate. I lowered my book, my hands trembling slightly, and offered him a small, tentative smile. To my surprise, he returned it, his eyes crinkling at the corners as if he were sharing a private joke with me. It felt like the world had fallen away, leaving just the two of us in that quiet, suspended moment. When he finally stood to leave, I felt a pang of disappointment, but then he did something that made my heart stop. As he walked past me, he glanced back over his shoulder, his expression soft and knowing, as if to say, "Are you coming?" And for the first time in years, I stood up and followed without hesitation. I didn't know what I was doing. My legs moved on their own, carrying me along the same winding park path he took, my breath quick and shallow. Every step felt like a decision I couldn't take back. He walked at an easy pace, as if he knew I was behind him, as if he wanted me there. I kept a careful distance, not wanting to appear too eager, though my heart betrayed me with its frantic rhythm. He stopped near the edge of the park, at a food cart selling fresh lemonade. I watched as he placed his order, his head tilting slightly as he listened to the vendor. There was a warmth to the way he interacted with people, an openness that felt rare. I lingered a few paces behind, debating whether I should approach, but before I could make up my mind he turned, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "Thirsty?" he asked, his voice smooth yet casual, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. I blinked, caught completely off guard. My voice felt trapped in my throat, but I managed a small nod. He handed me one of the cups, his fingers brushing mine briefly. The touch sent a shiver through me, subtle yet electric. "Thanks," I said softly, feeling the weight of his gaze as he studied me. "Do you always read in the park?" he asked, gesturing toward the book still clutched in my hand. "Not always," I admitted, my voice steadier now. "Sometimes I just come to people watch." A small smile played on his lips, and he nodded knowingly. "It's a good place for that." We stood there for a moment, the conversation easy yet charged with an unspoken tension. He leaned casually against the cart, his eyes never leaving mine. "Adrian," he said suddenly, offering his hand. "Amelia," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm, warm, and lingered just a second longer than necessary. "Nice to meet you, Amelia," he said, his tone carrying a hint of something playful, almost teasing. We walked together after that, our steps falling into an effortless rhythm. He told me about his work. He was a writer, always chasing ideas and inspiration. I told him about mine, how I spent my days editing manuscripts, shaping the words of others. "Maybe one day, you'll edit something I write," he said, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Maybe," I replied, a small smile tugging at my lips. When we reached the end of the park, I expected the moment to end. But instead he turned to me, his expression serious yet inviting. "Do you come here often?" he asked. "Sometimes," I replied, my voice soft. "Then maybe I'll see you again," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the city streets. But this time, I didn't feel the ache of his absence. Instead, I felt something else, hope, like the first stirrings of spring after a long winter. As I walked home, my mind replayed every moment, every word, every glance. For the first time in years, I felt alive, as if someone had peeled back the layers of my quiet, routine life to reveal something bright and new underneath. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. This wasn't the end of our story. It was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and uncertainty. Adrian and I saw each other again, just as he'd promised. Sometimes at the cafe, sometimes at the park. Our conversations grew longer, more personal, filled with laughter and moments of quiet understanding. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way his lips curved when he was deep in thought, the way he always carried a notebook, as though his mind never stopped working. He noticed things about me too. How I liked my coffee with just a touch of cinnamon, the way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous. But beneath the surface of our growing connection, I felt a tug of hesitation. Was this real? Was I foolish for letting myself feel this way? There was an unspoken gap between us. Our ages, our stages in life. And yet, every time I thought about pulling back, I found myself leaning in instead. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in hues of gold and amber, we sat on a park bench together. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Adrian had his notebook out, scribbling something between our shared silences. "What are you writing?" I asked, curious. He glanced at me, a playful smile lighting up his face. "Would you believe me if I said it was about you?" I felt my cheeks flush, and I laughed nervously. "You're teasing." "Not entirely," he replied, his tone softening. "You've been on my mind a lot lately, Amelia." The way he said my name made my heart flutter. There was a sincerity in his voice that left no room for doubt. I hesitated, the words forming on my lips before I could stop them. "Would you like to come over for dinner tomorrow?" The question hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. I didn't know what had possessed me to ask, but once it was out I couldn't take it back. Adrian's eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he might say no. But then his smile returned, warm and genuine. "I'd like that," he said simply. The walk home that night was a haze of emotions, excitement, nerves, and a deep sense of vulnerability. I spent the next day preparing, choosing recipes that felt both comforting and special. I set the table with care, lighting candles and placing fresh flowers in a vase. When the doorbell rang, my heart leapt in my chest. I opened the door to find Adrian standing there, holding a bottle of wine and wearing that familiar, easy smile. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "Thank you," I managed, stepping aside to let him in. As the evening unfolded, my nerves began to fade, replaced by the warmth of his presence. We talked and laughed over dinner, the conversation flowing effortlessly. He told me stories about his travels, his dreams, and the struggles of being a writer. I shared pieces of my own life, my work, my family, the quiet joys and sorrows that had shaped me. There was a moment, after the plates had been cleared and the wine glasses refilled, when the air between us shifted. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. "Thank you for inviting me," he said, his voice low and earnest. I looked into his eyes, my heart pounding. "I'm glad you came." The night was far from over, and I could feel the unspoken possibilities lingering in the air. For the first time in years, I let myself lean into the moment, letting go of the fears that had held me back for so long. The moments after dinner felt like standing on the edge of something vast and uncharted. We moved to the living room, the soft glow of the candles casting shadows across the walls. Adrian sat close, closer than before, his knee brushing mine as we talked. Our conversation had shifted, becoming slower, more deliberate. The words seemed to matter less now, replaced by the quiet language of glances and pauses. At one point, I reached for my wine glass and realized my hands were trembling. Adrian noticed too, his gaze softening as he gently took the glass from my fingers and set it on the table. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his voice a whisper. I nodded, unable to lie. "It's been a long time since I've let someone in like this." He leaned in slightly, his hand finding mine. His touch was steady, warm, grounding. "You don't have to be nervous with me, Amelia." Hearing my name on his lips sent a quiet thrill through me. I looked up at him, and in his eyes, I saw no judgment, no hesitation, only a patient kind of tenderness that I hadn't realized I'd been craving. "I feel foolish," I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I don't even know why you're here." "Why me?" Adrian's brow furrowed, and he shifted closer, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Why not you? Do you know how rare it is to meet someone who listens the way you do, who sees the world with such depth? I felt my breath catch, his words cutting through years of doubt and insecurity. Amelia, he continued, his hand still holding mine, you make me want to write again. You make me feel alive. The sincerity in his voice undid me. Before I could overthink it, I leaned forward, closing the small distance between us. My lips brushed his tentatively at first, testing the waters, but when he responded, his hand gently cradling my face, it was as though the floodgates had opened. The kiss deepened, slow and searching, every movement filled with an intensity that left me breathless. His touch moved to my shoulder, then to the curve of my waist, his hands reverent, as if he were afraid I might break. Is this okay? He murmured against my lips, his breath warm and uneven. Yes, I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. Time seemed to lose its meaning after that. We moved together as if we'd done this 1,000 times before, yet every touch, every kiss felt new and electrifying. He didn't rush, didn't push, letting me set the pace. I felt myself letting go of the walls I had so carefully built, surrendering to the moment. The vulnerability was terrifying, but Adrian's presence was steady, grounding me in a way I hadn't thought possible. We spent hours lost in each other, exchanging kisses and quiet confessions, exploring the fragile, magnetic bond that had drawn us together. By the time the candles had burned low, and the room was bathed in soft shadows, I felt as if something inside me had shifted irrevocably. In his arms, I wasn't just Amelia, the woman with a quiet, routine life. I was someone vibrant, someone desired, someone seen. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that I deserved it. The morning after felt like a dream, and yet it was real. The sunlight streaming through the windows was gentle, painting everything with a soft glow. I woke to find Adrian still beside me, his arm draped across my waist, his breath steady and content. For a long moment, I lay there, simply watching him, my heart full of thoughts and feelings I couldn't quite grasp yet. This wasn't supposed to happen. That's what I kept telling myself, even as I traced the lines of his hand on my skin. I had spent so many years guarding my heart, building walls so high that I couldn't even see over them. Yet here he was, breaking them down with each passing moment. I didn't know what the future held for us, but in that quiet space between sleep and wakefulness, I allowed myself to believe that there was something real between us. Something more than a fleeting connection, something deep enough to endure whatever might come our way. When he woke, his eyes met mine with the same quiet intensity they always had. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just a shared understanding that this moment was significant. Good morning, he whispered, his voice still thick with sleep. Good morning, I replied, my heart fluttering at the warmth in his voice. He sat up, stretching, and then reached for me, pulling me into his arms for a soft, lingering kiss. It wasn't hurried or urgent, just a quiet affirmation of the night we'd shared. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to sink into the feeling of his embrace. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. There was only the present, only this connection that felt so real, so right. Later, as we sat together at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and breakfast, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me to this point. My life, my quiet routine, had been so predictable, safe, but empty in ways I hadn't realized until now. I had been content in my solitude, but somewhere along the way, I had forgotten how to truly live, how to let myself experience joy, passion, connection. Adrian had reminded me of all the things I had lost, and in doing so, he had given me the courage to rediscover who I was beneath all the layers of time and routine. I wasn't just a woman of a certain age, a woman who had settled into her role in life. I was Amelia, the woman capable of love, capable of desire, capable of something more. And as I looked at him, sitting there with that quiet smile, I realized that age was just a number. Our connection wasn't bound by time or expectations. It was bound by something deeper, something that didn't need to be explained. I'm glad you came into my life, I said softly, my voice filled with gratitude. He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. I'm glad you let me in. And for the first time, I felt the weight of that decision, the decision to open my heart again. It had been terrifying, uncertain, but in the end, it had led me to a place I had longed for, even if I hadn't known it until now. This wasn't just a fleeting romance. It was a turning point, a rediscovery of myself. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that no matter what came next, I had found something rare and beautiful, and it had been worth every leap of faith.